Welcome to Seaside Quilting Tutorials. My name is Terry. Today we're going to talk a little bit about cutting fabric. Now, before we get started on the right way to cut fabric, I'm going to show you a couple of things that you don't want to do when you're cutting fabric. Now, most of you will be used to a cutter similar to this. Seaside has some really nice ones. They have a ergonomical one that puts less stress on your hands. However, before I found Seaside, I used something a little bit different. Some of you've seen it, some of you haven't. I happen to use one of these. Has a little handle, keeps my hand a little straighter, and because of the grip of it, it puts a lot of less stress on my hands. So that's what I'll be using today. These are not available through Seaside, but like I said, they do have some really nice ones. So when you're cutting fabric, one of the important things is to always keep your blade straight, up and down. You don't want to lean it to the side, either way. I'm right-handed, so you'll be seeing what I do is right-handed. I'm not going to be able to show you as left-handed. There are some tutorials out there for left-handed cutters. Things are a little bit reversed, but however, I can show you some of the basic techniques that will help you out. So like I said, you don't want to have your cutter be sideways, because if you do, it's going to be easy to veer off to the side and you're going to end up with a piece like this. And these kind of pieces don't make us happy because they end up in our scrap pile, or for me, in my garbage. Another thing that you don't want to do is when you're cutting, you don't want to go back and forth like this, because you won't get a nice straight cut. What you'll get is some extra little pieces dangling off to the side. Now, some people, when they're cutting through multiple layers of fabric, find it difficult for them to get enough pressure, and that's what causes them to want to do the back and forth. At any time that you feel unconfident about your cutting, what you can do is you go forward and stop. Now, if you just need like a little rest in your hand or whatever, then you can go forward a little bit more. Now, right there, I felt like I didn't go completely through the fabric. What I can do is go back to the beginning and come back and go through it. Now, I didn't get enough of a pressure there. As you can see, I didn't push down quite hard enough. So my fabric is laying to the side, and I know for a fact that there's no way that now at this point I'm going to get a straight cut. So I'm just going to finish cutting that off. And once again, now this is cheap fabric. It's nothing expensive. This is stuff that I've had probably on my shelves for about 30-ish years or so. And it's very thin fabric. You hold it up and you can literally see through it. And I never use it for my quilting. I use it for practice, when I'm practicing my free motion quilting, and different odd things. Sometimes I use it to set up a pattern or whatever, but I don't use it in my actual quilting or my products because it's not a very good fabric. But it's great. It has its purpose for other things, but definitely not in my projects. Okay, so when you're cutting, once again, you're going to want to keep your hands straight. You want to hold on to your ruler. And one of the things that I do, I don't know if you happen to have any of these around. A lot of us have these floating around. They're supposed to be for giving you some upper body exercise. That's what I'm supposed to be doing with them. However, I had some extras, and I use them to hold the end of my ruler. Now I do know that many of your rulers have a non-slip material on the bottom of your fabric, and they're not supposed to slip. The idea of them is that you put just a little bit of pressure on your ruler and it's not supposed to slip. However, if I'm making a really long cut, I want that extra confidence that my ruler's not going to move before I get to the end of the ruler. It just is like an extra little hand that I put there, holds the ruler down a little tighter for me. Once you get a little bit used to cutting, you may not feel that you need it anymore. But I can tell you that even after, shoot, I don't know how many years I've been cutting fabric, a lot, probably over 30 years, I still make mistakes. It happens. But to eliminate as many of those as possible, I like using my little hand weight on the end of my ruler, keeping my hand straight. I want to make sure that I'm putting enough pressure. You don't have to, some people are a little more light-handed when they cut. Some people have a heavy hand. I have a little bit of a heavier hand. That may be because I don't, in the holding of my cutter, maybe it's how I'm holding it this way that isn't giving me enough pressure sometimes. But the majority of the time, I'm going to be able to go through and cut and have a nice cut. There, what was I trying to think of? There are times when you may not have gotten a complete cut, and you might have just a little tiny piece in your cut that it didn't completely cut. And I'll show you when that happens, if I can get it to happen, so I can show you. I just use a little pair of scissors and I'll make that little snip in that tiny piece, so I can keep my piece the way that I want it. So you want to hold your rulers, your cutter rather, straight. Definitely want to keep your rulers straight. And you don't want to go too fast when you're cutting and have your hand go like this and zoom off to the side, because it's not that my ruler moved, it's that my hand veered off to the side. And once again, look at the nasty little cut that I got. It's definitely not straight. In the garbage we go with that. So moving my ruler over, this time I'm going to do a proper cut. Okay, so I have my hand straight. I'm going to go nice and smooth, but I'm going to make sure that I'm putting enough pressure. I'm going through some extra layers here today with this piece. The next piece that I'm going to show you is going to have the 4 layers that you would normally be cutting through. I'm cutting through about 8 layers, but I have a 60 millimeter cutter here. I keep a 45 millimeter at my sewing table, so that if I need to do cuts on my smaller mat over there when I'm doing paper piecing or whatever, I just keep the smaller one over there. I keep the bigger one over here. Just makes it a little more convenient for me. So when I go through, you don't want to hold your breath, because when you hold your breath, your body tenses. If your body tenses, things just aren't going to happen right. That doesn't matter if you're cutting or if you're sewing or you're quilting. You got to breathe. So, just relax, untense. Excuse me. Don't be too nervous while you're cutting. I know that's hard, when you're first learning how to cut. But you just want to hold your cutter straight, hold on to your ruler, and don't have your fingers way over here on the edge. I can promise you, even when you think that you have them back enough, I've had a couple times when I've nicked the edge of my finger. It is not good. The last time that I did it, I ended up needing stitches. So you want to have your hand well back. Always check the placement of your hand before you cut. Just a word of warning. So now my cutter is straight, my ruler's straight. I've got my little hand weight there to make sure that the top isn't going to wobble back to one side or the other, and I'm just going to make a nice smooth cut. And as you can see, when I've done that, I have a nice straight cut. Okay, so we've gone over some of the don'ts. Now there's a couple of things of importance. Let me just show you real quick. I gotta clean up my mat just a little bit because I've got some fabric in my cut. This is what they call a mat smoother. These are also available through Seaside Quilting. Now, I don't know if I can pick it up on camera, but here where I cut a little deep, your razor sharp blade cuts a little deeper into your mat, which they do heal as long as they don't have little fabric pieces stuck in those lines. When they try to heal and you've got fabric stuck in the lines, they're not going to heal over properly. And sometimes I'll take like my fingernail and I'll go like this, but I can feel those, even sometimes when you don't see them as well, I can feel them when I just rub my hand across my mat. You want to take good care of your mat because mats are not cheap. You don't want to have to replace them all the time. So I just take my mat smoother. It's not going to affect the lines of my quilt, you know, the ones set in by the manufacturer. Sometimes it will leave a little color behind. When I clean my mat with a non-abrasive cleaner, just a little spray-on thing, and a rag, it cleans a lot of that up. But just to make sure that my mat's going to be able to heal, not putting a lot of pressure on it, mind you, I'm just trying to grab those extra fibers so that I can wipe them off. Now when I feel back over where I know that line was, because it hasn't completely healed up yet, it takes a little time. It's a little cooler down here, so sometimes it takes a little longer. I can feel that there isn't a cut there anymore. Okay, so that's going to heal up nice and fine for me. And I don't do that after every cut or anything, but when I'm done cutting my fabric that I'm cutting, I definitely do clean my mat up. Now, I have an older mat. Don't throw your older mats away. They come in very handy. When you replace a mat, hold on to your older mat. Because when I'm cutting something that has batting in it, or I'm cutting fleece, or I'm cutting cuddle, minky, flannel, things that I know is going to leave a little more fiber behind, I use my older mats. And the reason why is because they leave a heck of a lot more fiber down on your mat than what your fabric's going to leave. And I just don't want to junk up a nice mat that I've spent a lot of money on to have on my table. So I keep some of the older ones around, and I use those when I'm squaring up a quilt that has batting in it, or any kind of a project that I know is going to do that. Okay, just another thing to keep in mind. Now, I don't have my nicer ruler with me today because the other day I dropped it on the floor, and since I have a cement floor, it cracked my nice ruler right in half, and it's not any good anymore. Now, Seaside does carry these nicer ones by Quilter Select. I really like these because they have extra markings in them. They not only have the 1/8 marks and the inch marks and half marks, but they also have the 1/16 marks. Now, it's not common that you're going to need 1/16, but every once in a while there is a piece that you may need to cut to that. Like I said, it's not overly common, but it is nice to have the rulers that have it. The Quilter Select has a nice back that is non-slip, and I find I have a lot less problems with it. With my cheaper ruler, bought it in years ago, back at I don't even remember when, does not have as nice of a backing on it. It's supposed to be non-slip, but I can tell you that I will slip with this ruler every once in a while. It just happens. It's not as well made. When I buy something that I'm going to use in my quilt room and I'm going to use it often, I like to buy quality. You're going to pay a little bit more for it, but in the long run, it's going to hold up better. Well, as long as you don't drop it on the cement floor, you're all good. Which I've dropped that same ruler many times and never had a problem. It's just the way that it hit. Anyhow, when you buy a quality product, that quality product is going to hold you up for years, and it's going to work better. It's going to save on your fabric. We spend a lot on our fabric. We don't want to be messing it up when we're cutting it. It can be quite frustrating. Now, if you're new to quilting and you haven't cut fabric before, it can be a little nerve-wracking. It's very understandable. So practice on something cheap. It can be old sheets that you cut out so that it, it's like your yardage. It could be some cheap yardage that you picked up, at a cheap box store, whatever. Those are good to practice on, because if you mess up and you have to chuck it in the garbage, who cares? It's not like you spent an arm and a leg for it. But when I buy quality fabric, I want to make sure that I'm going to be cutting it well. So if you're really, really new, I recommend practice. If you've been cutting for a while, but you're still not feeling overly confident about it, that's what I'm trying to help someone that is building confidence. I'm trying to help someone that hasn't cut before or has cut very little before. Quite a lot of you are experts and you don't even need this tutorial. Okay, so one of the other things that I want to point out, every ruler is created different. Every mat is created different. Now, we'd like to think that an inch is an inch and a quarter inch is a quarter inch and so forth. True enough, most of the time. But if I line my ruler up, well, this one doesn't line up too bad, so it's a little hard to show. But I've had some cheap rulers that when I put them onto my mat, they're off by sometimes a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch off from the markings on my mat. You have to choose what you're going to use to measure with. I regularly don't use my mat for my cutting. If I'm going to use my mat for cutting, I usually use it for yardage. Like, say I'm trying to set a half a yard aside for a project. I'm probably going to use my mat because it has the larger markings. If I'm squaring up a piece of fabric to get it ready to cut pieces, which I'm going to show you in a couple minutes, I'm going to use my mat. But when I am doing my measuring, I'm going to use a ruler. And when you start a project, you want to decide what size pieces I'm going to be most often cutting. So say you're doing a larger quilt and you're going to be using larger cuts. Creative Grid has this wonderful ruler that is 12.5 by, I believe it's 24.5. It's a great ruler. It's got a lot of extra markings on it. It's got a lot of potential for things that you can do with it. These are available at Seaside. Seaside has a lot of the Creative Grid rulers. And these Creative Grid rulers have this little code that you scan the code with your cell phone camera and it will bring up a tutorial that goes with their rulers. This ruler is not something that I use every day when I'm cutting, but if I know that I'm going to be cutting a lot of pieces that are 7 inches or 9 inches or 9.5 inches, whatever, this ruler is nicer because I can just cut my big pieces and keep going. And I have smaller rulers for when I'm working with fat quarters and whatnot, but my most common ruler is my 6 inch by 24 inch ruler. That's the most common size that most of us use. Excuse me again. Some people have one that's a little shorter. I think the shorter ones are 6 by 15 or something around there. I believe Barb also has those available for when you're not really making long cuts. And if you use a ruler that is closer to what you're going to be cutting for size, you're going to get more accurate cuts. But once you choose a ruler to start cutting your pieces for a quilt, and I can't stress this enough, you want to stay with that ruler. Because if you go from ruler to ruler, even if it's made by the same exact company, these are going through a machine to get made and printed. So once you start with a ruler, which I'm going to start this project with this ruler, I am going to continue to do every single cut for this block that I'm working on and the rest of the quilt with this ruler. Because that means that every piece that I cut is going to be accurate to this ruler. That keeps my stuff consistent. Now, if I was to jump from this ruler over to the Creative Grids ruler that I just showed you, I may not have an accuracy that I need. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Okay. Sorry, I've got a little bit of allergy problems going on. So I get a little congested and a little bit of a sore throat from time to time. So my voice changes a little bit and I have a little bit of a cough. So before you start cutting your fabric, you want to have it nice and pressed. Usually before cutting a block or a quilt out, I'm going to starch my fabric. Now I know that there's some debate out there about using starch, not using starch, which starch is better than the other starch and so forth. I just use breast press. And I use another kind called flatter, which isn't so much of a starch as it's harder for me to explain. Barb at Seaside explains it a lot better than I do. But I mainly use best press. It's what I like. You can get it unscented. You can get it scented with multiple scents, which is all a matter of preference. But I do find it keeps my fabric nicer and stiffer when I'm cutting and when I'm sewing. And that's important, that you're not having a lot of stretch when you're cutting so that you get accurate cuts. Same when you're sewing. Okay, so before we start with the fabric, we need to get a straight line to start with on the edge. This is really important because if you start with an edge that's already not straight, you're going to be getting more and more off the grain as you're cutting across your fabric. So now some people like to do where it's already folded selvage to selvage, which this already is. When I press it, I open it all the way up. I press it out, smooth out that deep line that gets in it from the fold, and then I refold it and make sure that it's selvage to selvage so that I don't have a wrinkling in my fabric and I won't have my ends so that one end is, you know, met up with salvage to salvage, and then when I get to the other end, all of a sudden it's not salvage to salvage anymore and it's more like this. That's going to set off your cutting. So you want to make sure from one end of your piece to the other end of the piece that it's folded salvage to salvage. If you're getting a wrinkling up in here when you fold it and you try to lay it out, it means that it's not flat, it's not straight. So your selvage is your straightest part of your fabric when you originally get it off of a bolt. So you just want to make sure that even if you have to ease some over here and maybe you're going to lose a little bit more on your edge, that's fine, because that's going to straighten out your fabric for you. Now some people like to leave their fabric folded salvage to salvage. I personally don't like to cut it this way because it's a longer cut for me. And the longer I got to cut, the more chance of something happening. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just saying this is how I feel about it, but other people are perfectly fine with having their fabric laid out, and you'll see some tutorials out there where this is how they cut their fabric. I don't. Now what I do is I will once again bring my fabric so that the selvage is down to that fold line now that I know that my fabric was straight. And then I'm just gonna run my hand across and I'm gonna create sort of another fold. I'm not, not a deep fold like when it comes off the bolt, but, creased enough so that I know when I lay it on the line, it's gonna be nice. And I check it from end to end to make sure that I have the selvage so that the edge of the selvage is laying on that fold. And I want it to be as straight as possible. Then I fold my fabric, flip my fabric over, which I could have folded it in a way that this fold was already down here. And I've got to get a nice straight edge on this end of my fabric. So in order to do that, I'm going to make sure that my fold is laying on that first line of my mat so that all the way down it's not sitting sideways. And that's important. You want to make sure from end to end that it's laying properly on that first line. I'm going to scoot it down just a little more because I'm kind of picky. I don't like to lose a lot of my fabric even though I'm getting it straight. This side, any part that's not even is going to hang over. Now depending on where you buy your fabric, usually when you get fabric from Seaside, they do a pretty darn good cut. They don't do one of these cuts where, this part might be, like cut so it's way over here and, all miscombobulated. You can see that I don't have a perfectly straight line, but it's pretty darn close. So I'm going to scoot that down just a little bit more because I don't need to take much off my end. And I'm going to use that very first line on this side. The very first straight line. And another thing about when you're cutting fabric, if you're going to cut a lot of pieces and you got to square up a lot of fabric, just scoot your fabric down to a different straight line. Like use, the number 3, use the number 10, use the number 16, whatever. Because if you always use this line, eventually you will create a deep groove in here. And as you're creating a deep groove in here that can't, over time, the more that you cut on it, the less it's able to heal. So I kind of break it up where I'm going to square up my fabric. So say, I've already done it a couple times there. I'll just scoot my fabric down and maybe use the number 1, maybe use the number 3. This just helps to preserve your mat for as long as possible. I gotta square my fabric back up here and get it nice and straight on the line again before I start cutting, so I don't waste my fabric. And so then you're gonna take your ruler, and I just kind of smooth across it so that I don't have it bubbled up. If I come in from this side, I might cause it to bubble up a little bit. So I just kind of run my ruler across from that side so that I know it's staying nice and smooth. And what I'm looking for is to make sure that the top of my ruler is sitting on that straight line as the bottom of my ruler. And you have some markings that extend past the line where your fabric is laying on. And that helps you to find your cut. This isn't quite sitting as flat as I would like it on that line. There we go. So you're going to get that. Now, anytime that you move the top of your ruler, the bottom of your ruler comes off of that line. So you want to hold the bottom of your ruler while you're moving the top of your ruler, because if you don't, every time you move one end to the other end is going to move on you. Now that I got that where I want it, I'm going to hold my hand there, and I'm going to put my hand weight just a little bit above where I'm going to cut. I don't want to run into it and cause it to make me have a mistake, but I want it to keep my ruler kind of steady. Excuse me. Okay, so once again, check your fingers. Make sure that they're nice and away from the edge. You want to hold your cutter so that it's nice and straight, and we're going to make a nice smooth cut. I always ease up my fabric slowly so I can make sure that I did a complete cut. I have a little piece at the end that didn't cut for me, but that's okay. So I'm just going to grab my scissors real quick, and I'm going to ease this up, and I can see this. It's just a little sliver that I didn't get. Barely anything at all. And I'm going to use my scissors, and I'm just going to snip that little piece off, and it's still straight, so I'm fine. So I got to look at what I need to cut. Okay. So my pattern says, and I can move this over now because, see, I'm not going to use any of the measurements on my mat. I'm using all my measurements on my ruler. So it doesn't matter where my fabric is sitting over here. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, I like to use my darkest lines to sit on my fold. And I want my line down here to be sitting perfectly straight on that fold of the fabric. And now I'm going to look at this side, and this side's off. I want to scoot it up until I get it so that it's flush, perfectly flush with that 1/2 inch line, because I'm going to cut a 2.5 inch strip, the width of the fabric. So I want to make sure that my 1/2 inch line is perfectly lined up and my bottom line is perfectly straight across the fold. Once again, I'm going to put my hands so that they're nice and steady on here. I'm going to put my little hand weight up at the top to keep my ruler nice and flat. You always want to check your measurements twice before you cut. Something could happen where you're moving from here to over there or whatever, that your measurement's not off. I always double check my pattern. Well, I'd like to tell you always, but I've had times when I didn't do as I know I should, and I've gone over and thinking that I needed, say, 7 7/8 cut, and when I get back, I go, oh, wrong fabric. That was supposed to be the other color. And if you've bought the exact amount of fabric that you need for a pattern, you don't want that to happen to you. So always check your measurement on your ruler twice. Make sure it's where it needs to be. I'm at perfectly 2.5 inches. That's where I need to be. Nothing has shifted, nothing has moved on me. So I make sure that my hands are nice and steady on my mat. My fingers are well away from the edge where I'm going to be cutting. I keep my cutter straight, not tilted to the side, not tilted to the other side. My blade is perfectly up against the edge of my ruler, and I'm going to make a nice smooth cut across. Now I can hear when I got to the end of that I didn't go through all 4 pieces of fabric. Over time, you're going to learn by the sound of your cut whether or not you made it through, and I need a new blade on my cutter. So I'm just going to ease back through, and now I can hear that I got the last of that. And I can move that up, and I can see that, yep, I got through all my pieces, and now I'll move my ruler. Once you move your ruler, you will never get that piece straight. It's going to be a scrap piece. So now I've got a nice 2.5 inch strip. That's the width of the fabric. Okay, so we're going to set this fabric aside. And now, from this piece, I would need to get this selvage off. The selvage is no good. It's just to keep your fabrics straight on the edge, and they do printing on there so that they know what fabric. This happens to be the dark blue from the Home to Roost by Wilmington Prints. Beautiful fabric, gorgeous fabric. Right now I'm cutting the solid pieces. Later on I'll cut the floral pieces. But it's hard sometimes for me to talk and concentrate at the same time. So I'm doing this, that I know I have a little extra. Okay. So I already know that I just cut on the first line, and that hasn't completely healed, of course, yet. So I'm moving over to my number 2. I'm going to take my piece. I'm going to use a nice solid line. I want my selvage to be over past the number 2, going this way. And I want to make sure that the straight bottom of my fabric is once again laying straight on my line. If it's off a little bit, I'm not going to get a straight cut down here. And that's important that I get that right now. Now I'm just cutting a little ways, but it's still, once again, I don't want that to bubble up, so I'll come from the other side, smooth it over. Once I get that bottom of my ruler on the line where I want it, I'm going to double check the top and make sure that I have it on the line. Now, right here, this is where I'm focusing on the line on the mat, because I need to square this piece up and get a nice straight edge so that I can cut my pieces going along. Since I'm cutting such a short distance, only 2.5 inches, I'm not going to worry about using my hand weight. If you feel more confident with it, that's fine. I'm not going to use it right now because it's such a small cut. I'm going to make sure that my fingers are well away from the edge of the ruler. I'm going to make sure that my cutter is nice and straight, and I'm going to do my cut. And I can hear that I got through all my pieces. But I don't move my ruler until I've checked with my fabric to make sure that I got that cut. Because once you move that ruler, you can't fix it. You will not get a straight edge. You will have to start over. Okay, so that can go into the garbage. Now that I have my straight edge, I'm not worried about where my fabric is sitting on my mat, because I'm not using the measurements from my mat. I'm using my measurements from this ruler when I cut my pieces. Okay, so with this I need 2.5 inch wide, and now I need it to be 1, 2, 3, 4.5 inches. And yes, that's where it is. I'm going to use my darker line to be on the bottom edge of the fabric, and I've got a dotted half, like a lighter dotted line, not quite dotted, but dashes on the side, and I want to make sure that that's perfectly sitting on the edge of the fabric. That might be a little bit harder to see with my camera. That's why I'm trying to over describe everything. I had bought a new thing for my camera, and it won't angle down properly for my videos, so I'm going to have to go and find a different one. Anywho, so I know that I've got it perfectly straight, and like I said, you're always going to measure twice so that you cut once, because once you cut your fabric, you've cut your fabric. You can't, it's not going to go back together. So it's important to double check, and I'm going to double check again. 1, 2, 3, 4.5 inches. keeping my fingers well away from the edge of the ruler, keeping my cutter straight, and it wasn't because I was over here. So you always want to double check that too. See, where is my razor? I need it to be up against that ruler. If it's over to the side, I'm going to tend to veer off and we're going to have a problem. And I'm not going to be happy. Okay, so we make our cut. Now I need 2 of those. Well, I need 4 pieces. I have 1 on that side, 1 on that side. So that's 2 pieces. But I need 4. Yep, I need 4 that are 4.5 inches by 2.5 inches. So 2.5 inches wide, 4.5 inches long. I'm going to double check my ruler. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm on the half line. I've got my darker line down on the bottom, and I've got my half marking there, holding my hand in place, making sure that I'm breathing. I've double checked. I can check again, say I'm worried. If you're not confident at all, stop. Go back, check your ruler. 1, 2, 3, 4.5. Yes. My bottom line is lined up. My side line where I need it to be is lined up. My fingers are well away from the edge. I'm going to hold my cutter nice and straight. My blade is up against my edge of my ruler, and I'm going to make my cut. And when I'm cutting small pieces, I tend to go a little faster. If I'm cutting a lot of, length going this way, I go a little bit slower, because the faster you go when it's a long cut, you have a chance of making a mistake. Okay. So now I've got my 4 pieces of that. Now I need 4 pieces that are 2.5 by 2.5. I know that I have 2.5 this way. I got to go 2.5 this way, and I'm going to make a nice square. So checking my ruler, I got 1, 2 inches. I'm on my half. I've got my dark line down here. I've got my half mark there. It's nice and flush. I'm going to hold it in place. My fingers are back. My blade's up against my ruler. Over here on the mat, doesn't matter if I go back and forth. I'm not doing it on the fabric. I'm just making sure that my blade is up against my ruler, nice and comfy where it's supposed to be. And I'm going to make my cut. So I've got 1 square that's 2.5 by 2.5. I've got 2 pieces. I need 2 more. So once again, 1, 2.5. I'm going to line that up. And it was off just a little tiny bit. Okay, we got that lined up. Once again, my fingers are well away. I'm feeling a little unconfident. Wait a minute, did I double check that? 1, 2.5. I'm going to look at it again. Everything is all lined up. My fingers are back away from the edge of the ruler. I've got my cutter nice and straight. It's up against my ruler where it needs to be. And I'm going to make my cut. Okay, so now I've got my 4 pieces of my 2.5 by 2.5. And I've got my 4 pieces that are rectangles that are 2.5 by 4.5. So that's pretty much the basics of ruler cutting. You just have to relax, you have to breathe while you're cutting. A couple of things that are helpful for people. Some people find it difficult to match up the ruler markings when they're on a mat. Visually, they're seeing the markings from the mat and they're seeing the markings from their ruler. And it takes a little extra concentration to just watch your fabric, that you're getting your ruler lined up with your fabric. So I have my marking down at the bottom and I have my marking on the side. And say I wanted to now for some reason, this last piece, say I needed it to only be 2 inches wide, I'm not going to cut it, I'm just going to show you. I can go 1, 2, I'm keeping my darker line on the bottom, and I'm making sure that I get the top, just easing it over, making sure that I got it nice and straight, both on the bottom, both on the side, and I can see that my fabric isn't sitting the way that I need it to be with a nice straight line. So I'm going to fix that before I make a cut. You want to concentrate on your ruler as best you can. Ignore all the lines around you. You're only going to be concerned with that straight line on the mark for the bottom, and that you're getting the mark on the side. And this is where people sometimes visually have a hard time seeing their marking up against the edge of their fabric. Some people have mats, probably most of you, not all of you, probably your mat can be on the back side, might not have any markings at all. So once you've gotten straight edges on your fabric, you could use for practice the back side until you're getting used to your ruler lining it up. Another thing that can help, which I don't have handy, is sometimes people will slip a piece of paper underneath this side until they get it up to the piece and can visually see that they've gotten it up. I've never done it, but I've had a couple people tell me that that works for them. I just never do it. I just have to concentrate on where my, on my fabric, not on the lines underneath that are showing through my ruler. If I'm going to cut, say, a lot of pieces, which I'm not doing today, but say I was, I have this tape. It's by Omnigrid. It's called Glow Line tape. Other companies might have some. I don't know for sure if Barb has this tape, but she probably can get it. It's a very see-through tape, but has just enough color to it. And I bought a package. It had like the orange, the pink, and I think yellow. It's pretty see-through tape. Now you could possibly use painter's tape. The only thing that I don't like about painter's tape is that when you take it, you'd want to use a very thin, not so wide of painter's tape. Like, you don't want it really wide, because as you pull the tape off, sometimes the edges will ripple and you won't be able to lay it on your ruler straight. But if you get I think they do have 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch painter's tape, so you could probably use that as well. So I'll cut a piece of this, and I don't do like a whole long line of it because it's going to be so hard to line it all up. This is just something that helps me to guide, so you can see, hopefully, let me see if I can get this up here so that you can see it. I've got a piece of the tape right here. I hope you can see that. And I've got it so that it's marking for me, let me see, 1/4 inch over, so it's at the 3/4 mark on my ruler. And so I might put a piece there and then put like a piece down here. And before you press it down real good, you just want to make sure that you're getting it nice and straight, that you're checking all your lines as you're putting it down. That's definitely not straight. I mostly use this when I'm doing long arming on smaller rulers. If I'm trying to use a line over and over. This is a little bit harder to do on camera, but you just want to get your tape so that the edge of it is leaning perfectly up against your lines. And the nice thing about this tape, rather than using painter's tape, is that as I press it down, I can still see my markings underneath my ruler. but it gives me a visual guide when I'm cutting over and over, say, and that's not straight at all, by the way. But it's just kind of to give you the idea. I'm a little more meticulous before I do any measuring with it. But anyways, it's just kind of there for a guide for you to mentally remember, I'm coming way over to here to make my cut. Okay? And then I'm going to be using where the edge of that tape is. This piece is not laying on my ruler straight at all. But I can see that, and actually if I got that on to the edge of my, and this tape comes off, as you can see, like really easy. So if I got this on my fabric, measured up, makes it a little easier to apply the tape as well, so that I can get it on those lines nice and straight where I want it to be. But you can see through the tape, which is nice. And so some people find that that's helpful. I usually only find it a little helpful when I'm doing long arming. I thought I was gonna like the tape. Personally, I don't use it a lot. Once in a great while, if I'm doing some ruler work, because I don't have any other lines that I have to worry about on a mat or anything else. It helps me to remember where I'm going to on my ruler. But some people do use it when they're doing a lot of cutting, and if they're doing a long cut, they'll put small pieces of tape going down through just to remember where they're coming through, but they have enough lines in between their tape to check their measurement, which is important because you want to make sure that you're getting a nice cut. So before we go, the other handy thing with your ruler is when I go to put away my fabric, and we all have storage problems and so forth. So I'm just going to show you this little handy trick before we go. The nice thing about most bookshelves don't have a lot of, you know, width from the back to the edge for us to put our fabric on, and we want to make, you know, if you want to make a nice line of fabric, coordinating your colors or just for storage, whatever. This ruler comes in handy, being 6 inches wide. And when your fabric is folded selvage to selvage, and then the fold to the selvage, it's going to be approximately 11.5 inches in length. So I just take my fabric and I fold it over my ruler. Doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be all the way to the edge. It could even be in the middle, however I want it. And I just fold it over and fold it over, and I keep doing it until I come to the end. To say this end was, you know, not enough, that I felt like it was going to go over there far enough. Sometimes I'll fold the, you know, like if I had excess over here and it was going to hang out to the other side, I, you know, will fold this edge and then fold it over. But this one is going to lay the way that I want it. Then I just pull my ruler out and my fabric stays nice and folded. And then I can take it and I can put it on my shelf, nice and neat, and I can stack them next to each other. And it's just a nice, handy way of storing your fabric without having to go and buy comic book cards or those special fabric folder cards. Those add up to money. I personally like to save everything that I can to use back in my fabric and my tools for cutting. Okay, so I hope that this tutorial has helped you a little bit today. If you have questions, please feel free to post them underneath the video. I'll be more than happy to answer. If it's something that I can't explain, then I'll shoot together another tutorial for you. Anyways, that's it for today. We are Seaside Quilting Tutorials. My name is Terry. You'll be seeing me more times making some other things. We have some other exciting tutorials coming up. So happy sewing. Have a great day.